Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Hidden History, Backstories from Ashland and Medford History, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Kayla Samnath, one of your adult services librarians. This program is being recorded, so please mute your microphone and turn off your camera so we can ensure a good quality recording. There will be time to answer your questions at the end of the program, so please put them in the chat box. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. Today's presenter is Joe Peterson. Joe Peterson has taught history, political science, and education courses at Southern Oregon University. He's also written and managed Teaching American History federal grants for Southern Oregon Education Service Districts in Medford. He is the author of 4 books, including 2 on the history of Ashland. Thank you, Joe, for being with us today. And thank you all for having me as well. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Joe.
Okay, thank you. This is a bit of an experiment because we haven't tried to do a hybrid approach before. What I want to do is show you a number of stories from Southern Oregon. I've been here about 24 years, and if you've been a resident of Southern Oregon, you hear bits and pieces of all kinds of stories, all kinds of historical stories, some true, some not. But anyway, it's kind of fun to explore some of those. And one of the first ones that I heard when I first came was that there was this warehouse in Ashland that produced Lincoln logs and mouse traps and all kinds of toys. And I thought, that's odd and interesting. I just sort of put it in the back of my mind and then decided, well, you know, at some point I ought to look at that to see what that's all about. So I took a look at Jim Parsons, who had a place on Hellman Street. And Jim is a very interesting guy. He graduated from Ashland High School, and then he went on to the normal school, and he met Angus Bomer there, of course. And Angus Bomer put him in a play right away. And he actually did some acting for Angus. Then he went on to the U of O, got a degree, and of course along came World War II, and he served in the military. And then he did a number of other sort of unusual jobs, and then worked his way back to Ashland by the late 40s, and decided he would start a box company for all the orchards. And he had 2 things that really bothered him. One was that all these pieces of lumber that were being developed and planed and so forth were being burned in those burners that you've seen pictures of, and they weren't being made use of. And he just thought that was ridiculous, that all this lumber that could have been used for various things. And so he made the boxes. Well, that worked for a while, and then, as you probably know, the orchards all went to cardboard. And he had to find another niche. And that niche was Mattel Toys, who needed little pieces of wood for their various toy manufacturing. And also he found that mouse trap makers needed the base for the mouse and the rat traps. It's a little bit of a misnomer. They didn't actually make the traps there. They made the base for the traps there. And then he found that Mattel and a couple other companies could use, Lincoln Logs was another one that was produced there. Pretty soon they were making all kinds of products, louvers for doors, and he was just brilliant at finding niches for all this. He's in my opinion, the first real recycler in the valley many years ago. And then the other thing that bothered him besides that was the fact that he didn't feel workers, hourly wage workers, were paid appropriately. And so he instituted a number of changes And this is in the 40s and the 50s. So you have to allow for the perspective of that. He went from 3 employees to a little over 100, just producing from scraps and scrap wood. He believed in 3 things for his workers. One was well pay. He paid you if you didn't get sick. You got an extra day's pay or you got a day off. He also paid you if you didn't have an accident with the tools and the equipment. And so anybody who didn't have an accident over a certain number of days or weeks also got a day's pay or they got a day off. And finally, he believed in profit sharing, the idea that his employees should benefit if he benefited. Now, all these things are sort of common today, but he was doing this in the 40s and the 50s. And so he was really very, very progressive in that regard. Everything is going along and he's really below the radar in a lot of people's mind. They really don't know what's going on there. They just know that there's some mousetraps being built over there and maybe some Lincoln logs. And then an interesting thing, he decided in 1980 that here was a teachable moment, he said. He was going to help people understand how important small businesses are and what they mean to the economy. And so in 1980, he had his bank order hundreds of $2 bills. Those $2 bills rolled in, and these were hourly workers. And so as a result, they got paid 1 week in $2 bills. A year later, there were still $2 bills circulating in Ashland as well as other parts of Southern Oregon. The point is, he wanted people to understand the importance of small business and what it can do for a community and how it does help the economy. Well, along came another event, which all of you are aware of in the lumber business, or if you've been in the valley very long, and that is the spotted owl was listed as an endangered species. And all of a sudden, there's all kinds of loss of jobs, and there's a need to find out if there's some other way to make things work. And this actually exposes his whole concept because they did, the timber companies did a study to find out if in fact there were some other niches, some other ways that they could produce for the economy. And they found Jim Parsons, and he became a national study because of the fact that he had found all these niches so early on. And now he's, this study is almost like a case in its own right. And you can, in fact, get a copy of that and see how innovative this guy was at this time. Well, that led me to another of my curiosities, and that is, I've always wondered since I came here, how could this little dealership in Ashland, Oregon, become the 3rd largest car dealers in the United States? How did that happen? I mean, that's very strange. And so I have a picture there of Walt DeBoer's dealership. I think I call it the little dealership that could, because it expands to such a degree. But what happens is a tragedy, actually, that makes some of this come about. Walt was crossing the street, Highway 99, up towards Phoenix area, Phoenix Talent area, and he was hit by a car. And he lived about a week, never came out of a coma, and passed away. Well, that meant that Sid DeBoer, his oldest son of 6 kids, all of a sudden had to take over the dealership. And he had been working there. Sid had been working there as a bookkeeper and a manager, so he knew the business somewhat. And he then got the second bad set of news. On top of his father passing away, Chrysler, Dodge, Plymouth decided that they would withdraw they would give him 2 years to end the dealership. in Ashland. And they were going to pull it. And so he had to figure out what to do. About this time, Dick Heilman comes into the picture because he's a representative from Chrysler. And he comes to help Sid dispose of the dealership in Ashland. But he also has an idea. He says to Sid, what if I could get you a dealership in Medford? Which he did. And Sid DeBoer really liked Dick Heilman, and they were perfect pair. They sold cars together. He said they were so good at selling Dodges, they didn't know it. They sold 30, 40 Dodges in a month. And he said, we didn't know how to make any money yet, but we sold a lot of cars. And so the problem was then, how do you do something with all this? And over time, the two partners were able, in fact, to come up with something. They ended up with 5 dealerships. They had dealerships up through all the way up to Grants Pass. But Sid had gone to a session that talked about public dealerships. So kind of a new concept. And he didn't do it. They didn't do it right away. They had their few dealerships. Now, how do you buy another dealership? Well, what you usually have to do in those days is leverage what you have in each dealership in order to get to another one. It's very time consuming. You have to convince the bankers, and they may or may not respond. And so, is there a better way? Well, this public dealership idea never left Sid's mind. And as a result, by 1996, he and Dick had put together a dog and pony show. They went to 20 cities, 50 presentations. They flew by commercial airplanes, and they ended up in motels. I mean, nothing fancy. And they said it was very hard sell. They were looking for investors, because if you're going to do a public dealership, that's an IPO. We're more familiar with it because a lot of you know about the Dutch Brothers IPO that was just done recently and very successfully. It just simply means you're going to have stockbrokers. You've got to convince them to invest. Well, they found that they didn't know very much about cars and about car dealerships. In fact, in New York, when they talked with the investors there, many of the stockbrokers didn't own cars. They used public transportation. So just trying to convince these people that this could possibly could grow. Stockbrokers are looking for growth. And here are a couple of guys from way out in Oregon who are trying to convince them that this should somehow work. Well, they were successful. And they were able, in fact, to convince the brokers. And they went, they raised a little over 20, I think it was $27 million by the initial public offering. Now, that made it possible within 3 years for them to grow their business from 5 stores to 41 stores. Think about that, the size, the ability to go to that extent. They currently are, they've spread all the way across the country. You could be in New York, Buffalo, New York. You could be in Florida, and it's still on your license plate will have a Lithia frame around it. I've often thought about that. Do you think any of those people know where that name came from? Probably not, because Walt had named it way back in 1946 after the Lithia water in Ashland, Oregon. But anyway, as a result of all this, they have been very successful. As I say, they're currently the 3rd largest motor group, auto group. They're in 20 states. In fact, usually what I have to do is go read their webpage to find out how big they are now, because it's probably grown since I did this. 15,000 employees. So you can see why I call it the little dealership that could. It's a pretty amazing success story. Both the DeBoers and Heilman family have given generously to the Rogue Valley and its needs. I decided I better put a transition in here after I watched the State of the Union last night. because they needed a few more transitions in that speech, because I'm jumping from topic to topic here. So I've given you a couple of entrepreneurs and their stories. By the way, just a little editorial comment. I'm not sure that as historians, we do a very good job of covering business history and how important businesses are. I think that's really quite lacking. You just don't see an emphasis on that. Well, anyway, I decided also I wanted to look back because there were a couple of current concerns that I thought, they're connected, at least in some ways. One of them is we hear so much about a stolen election, as you're aware. And then the other thing that we are very conscious of are raging forest fires, obviously. So I'd like to kind of transition to a couple other stories along the line here. First one is I have to go all the way back to 1876 for a documented theft of an election, some say. There's still a debate. It's a question of whether a deal was cut in 1876 between the Republican candidate and the southern states. What happened was there were two sets of electors from 4 states, including one from Oregon, that were sent in. Well, the problem is, what does Congress do with that? So they created a commission to decide those 20 delegates or 20 electoral votes. They all went to Hayes. Tilden didn't get any. And so immediately there was an argument, this is a corrupt deal. This can't be. Out of 20 electoral votes, some of them should have gone to at least one of the other guys. Well, anyway, as a result, Hayes was branded as a fraud because people thought that he had unjustly gotten the presidency. Well, so what? I mean, that tends to be an Eastern issue, back and forth, but it isn't, because Hayes came west, and he came to the 2 biggest cities in Southern Oregon, Ashland and Jacksonville. And he got very different receptions at those 2 different locations. He also came by stagecoach because the railroad wasn't completed yet, as you probably are aware, north and south, that is. And so he came by a 6-horse stagecoach. And when he came to Ashland, they had a huge party for him. Remember now, he's the Republican candidate, the Republican president. And they just went all out. The cannons boomed. They had bands playing. They built a special stage for him on the plaza so that he could, in fact, speak to the group. But he also had a couple other people with him that are pretty famous. His wife, Lemonade Lucy, they used to call her, because she was a strong prohibitionist, and so was Ashland. So that kind of blended together and made sense. The other famous person along riding shotgun was William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general. And by this time, he's the head of the army. And what's interesting is they were a little bit concerned about Black Bart, the bandit that they had heard about that ran between, he used to rob stagecoaches between the towns, especially between California and Oregon. And so they thought it was only appropriate that he would be along. There were no incidents though, and they arrived without any kind of problem. And to this tremendous applause and attention. So then the Ashland folks sent a wire down to Jacksonville, or up to Jacksonville, and said, the president's coming. The plans were that he would stay at the U.S. Hotel, which was just completed at that time. And so they went off to Jacksonville. Jacksonville's newspaper, has the Democrat name in it. And there was no advance man, obviously, because Jacksonville was staunchly Democrat and very anti-Hayes. And so as a result, there was no band to meet them, no greeting. A few straggling folks showed up from Jacksonville to greet the president. A few of them came over and shook hands with him. William Tecumseh Sherman said, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'd rather have an authentic greeting than, some stage thing. So it's okay that be the case." Well, it wasn't okay with the national press. And they just ripped Jacksonville for being so inhospitable to the president, the sitting president of the United States. So the interesting thing to me is the country was very split by this election, and you know the rest. Now, what about forest fires? I decided, well, I'm going to take a look at this. Terry Skibby, many of you know, has a tremendous collection of photos. And one of them he showed me was this one of the fire, the great fire in the watershed in Ashland, right up behind the theater there and the park back in 1959. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm going to look into that. Well, it actually turned out to be an arson fire. And it turned out to be destroy 4,000 acres. Huge fire. But there's really more to the story than that, which is, I think, kind of interesting. In August of 1959, there were a number of things going on. There was the state centennial, the 100 years of Oregon statehood. There was a big celebration of that. There was the new theater, had just been completed, and the new outdoor theater. So that was celebrated. They had Ginger Rogers there. They had the Governor Hatfield came. So this is a very big deal in August. But there's also a 4,000 acre wildfire going on one day, August 8th. So it's a pretty serious issue. Well, I interviewed a couple of people about this, and I thought, really, they continued to have the play go while the forest fire was going? And yes, they did. In fact, it's sort of amazing. Here's Peggy. I called Peggy Rubin. I don't know what that is. And she said, in those days, we didn't cancel plays. We just went ahead with it. So what had happened is Bill Patton, the manager of the Shakespeare Festival, had made a deal with the fire marshal. And Patton's deal was that if the fire broke into Lithia Park, the northern part of Lithia Park, then he would give Patton the sign, and then he would dismiss the theater goers. It was a sold out show, of course. And the problem was, up till then, the fire marshal preferred that the people stayed in the theater because that way they weren't blocking the streets when he was trying to get all the fire apparatus in. So it turned out to be kind of a crazy time, but it's fun to talk to Shirley Patton about it because she said you could see the faces of the audience. And she said, this is a night performance. You never get to see the faces. Well, she said, this time you did, and they looked like big red tomatoes because the glow from the fire and the roar from the fire. And she said that the other thing that was interesting was how the trees blew up. They just disintegrated, just popped. And so here they are trying to carry on their play. And at the same time, as soon as they get off the set there, they go on the back to see how far the fires come. And Shirley said nobody missed their entrances in those days. In that particular day, she said everybody was very alert. And so as soon as the play was over, to a standing ovation, everybody got the heck out of there. And some of the male actors, just changed clothes and went up the hill to fight the fire. So it was an incredible forest fire that I didn't know much about, honestly, until Terry showed up with that photo, and you can appreciate how big a deal it was. Well, about the same time in 1959 and 60, There's a Senator John Kennedy who comes to Oregon fairly regularly. And, been several times. Well, Oregon doesn't have very many delegates to the convention. They only even have 6 electoral votes. So what was this all about? Why was Kennedy Senator Kennedy so concerned about making sure that he captured Oregon? And in the process, both SOU and also Medford's parade, Pear Blossom Parade, benefited because they both got to see him at that time. So here's Kennedy departing. Why does he need it? Because Kennedy is a Catholic. And in 1960, there's a lot of question about whether a Catholic should be president of the United States. Oregon was overwhelmingly Protestant. It was the feeling of the Kennedy team that if they could win Oregon, they would put forever this end to this attitude, this anti-Catholicism that was going on, and that they would win the nomination because they would appear to be invincible. And so that was the strategy behind why he spent his time here. The only problem is, what happened here? I lost a slide, I think. I'll go on. Here we go. And let me go to the next one. He had a task. He had to beat the favored son, because by this time there was a Stop Kennedy movement. And it was the guy that was going to do it, they felt for sure, was Wayne Morris from Oregon. And so if they could defeat Kennedy in Oregon, they thought they all had a chance. Johnson, Humphrey, Symington, there were a whole slug of people that were running or would run. And Stevenson, Adlai Stevenson had already run twice, and there was the possibility of a third run. But Stevenson made the statement that if Kennedy can carry Oregon, he deserves to be the presidential candidate. And he was successful, as you know, in stopping this movement and winning the election. But I had an opportunity to talk to Art Kreisman before he passed away, and he told me wonderful stories about what it was like to have John Kennedy, a candidate, come to his house for a coffee just before he came to what was SOC, many of you know that, before he came there for a speech. And this was on Liberty Street, and it was supposed to be just a small coffee of friends that Kreisman had invited to meet the senator. 300 people showed up. Fortunately, he had a fairly large yard and big living room. But the problem he found was that the president, or the future president, Kennedy, had a very sore throat. And he didn't think he could give his speech over at the college. And so Kreisman got a hold of his own doctor, and he came and administered to the future president's sore throat, so that he could at least get through the speech. And he said the other problem was Pierre Salinger was the press secretary for Kennedy, and Pierre Salinger always smoked big, ugly cigars. And Salinger would march back and forth over Kreisman's new carpets and dump cigar ashes, which he had to sort of tolerate. The other things Salinger would do is make long distance phone calls, lots of them. And Kreisman said that he could see he was going to have to use a month's salary just to cover all this. And he was a little worried about it. Later on, he did find that the Kennedy team sent enough money to cover it. And they were able to, in fact, vacuum up the ashes that Salinger left all over the place. Over at Medford, at the Pear Blossom Festival, the Grand Marshal of the parade was Kennedy. And He was chauffeured by Walt Watkins, who had a 1959 Lincoln convertible, the perfect car for Kennedy. And maybe you've seen pictures of Kennedy at they're quite proud of those at the parade sites. So we had a visit from a future president, but I always kind of wondered why Oregon was so important. And so I did the research on it, and then I began to understand the Kennedy strategy and what they were trying to do. And that was his 8th victory. He beat Morse pretty solidly. 8th victory, and he did seem inevitable after that. So it worked out quite well. But little irony in all this, who wins the election from Oregon, or who wins the Oregon electoral votes? Richard Nixon. He defeated Kennedy fairly decisively in Oregon. So he did win the nomination, but he lost the election, at least in the state. Okay, I want to throw a little humor in here. I think it's kind of humorous. I played a fair amount of golf out at the Ashland's golf course, and I had a tendency sometimes on the 4th hole to slice my golf ball. It's a short hole, but I would often slice it to off the green. Well, the problem with that is there's a cemetery there. I thought, I played a lot of golf courses, but why is there a cemetery here? But I never got into it. I never did much with the question. Well, lo and behold, I did find out. I found Mike Dawkins, who told me the story as to how the cemetery was discovered. And I just thought it was kind of an interesting little story. The jobs of cleaning up along the golf course fell to Mike because his dad, Bill Hawkins, had taken the lease on the golf course. And the golf course, by the way, had gone through some tough years and hadn't been well maintained. And so he sent his son, as a teenager, Mike, down on the tractor to clean up that area down there in the corner, right by Croston and 66 meet, right there where that hole is. And so he did, and he was in there with the brush. He even put a special blade on the tractor, so you get into this brush. And as he got in it, all of a sudden he said, "It go clank," and then clank, and what's going on? So he got off his tractor, because this is supposed to be just brush, just grass. And lo and behold, he was hitting tombstones. And we'll show you those in just a minute. Before I switch slides, though, those of you with really good eyes and know your geography know that that's not the 4th hole. That's the 3rd hole, because you see the Pilot Rock sticking up there. Just for clarification, it happens to be the only picture we have of the original golf course in 1927. So I had to use that one. But that isn't, it's one more hole before you get to that. Well, this is what he dug up. On the left there, you see the tombstones. There actually are 4 people buried there. There are a couple children buried there as well. And so what's the backstory? How's all this come about? How do you end up with this cemetery? Well, the native, as you know, probably the native people were removed in a 3-year, killed, removed. It's brutal, in a 3-year war. And some of the early settlers out that way had donation land claims. And these were land claims that they could make. Well, they're, as you know, until they move out the native peoples, they have nothing but battles back and forth. In fact, there's a cemetery out there with a whole bunch of people who died during that time frame. Well, the Wells family land claim they established in 1853, and they built a cabin, and he built a sawmill out there, and he settled in that area. Then he sold off the property over time because the donation land claim was large, hundreds of acres. And over time, it got sold off. And as I said, the golf course hadn't been terribly well maintained. So over time, everybody lost track of where these burials were. It was not uncommon, as you probably know, for pioneer families to bury their loved ones on their own property. And that's what they had done. And put it in, and it just over time, it had just been covered up with brambles. So that's what he ended up finding. And the course opens in 1927. You can see the chronology there. And we end up with these tombstones today. They're still there. And the other two of their children are there. And there's a nice fence around it. However, I've convinced myself that it's still best when you're on that tee to try not to hit your ball too far to the right, because the Wells family are still there at rest. Well, here's another one that puzzled me. You probably gathered by now that I'm just curious about a whole lot of historical things. And so here's another one that got me. Why in the world would, I did a little research on the library, actually both libraries, the two Carnegie libraries, one in Ashland, one in Medford. And I couldn't figure out, there were people who opposed these. In Ashland, there were two city council members who said, nothing to it. We're not taking money from some robber-Barron, Carnegie. And in Medford, the paper just had editorial after editorial against Carnegie. And particularly because they said he employed child labor, that he was brutal, strike breaker, on and on and on in his steel mills. And so I got kind of intrigued by that. I thought, well, how many communities would, all I've ever heard about and all I ever studied was communities who with open arms would take in these libraries. Now you realize what Carnegie was providing was the building. The community still had to supply the land site and the inner workings, the books and things like that, and pass a bond so that they could support it over time. But I just couldn't believe that until so I looked it up, and sure enough, I found this book, and I'll read it for your benefit in the audience here. Carnegie Denied: Communities Rejecting Carnegie Library Construction Grants from 1898 to 1923. A whole book on communities that didn't want a Carnegie Library. And I got into the book and studied it a little bit, and Ashland's city council members, or a couple of them, and the Medford paper weren't that far off. 47 communities turned down Carnegie money. And it was very much ideological because of, very much because they saw him as a robber-Barron, and that he was trying to make, I think what they said was he was trying to make monuments to himself, and they didn't want to support that. Something as innocuous as a library, because sometimes I think we think everything in the past was very smooth and easily dealt with and handled. And something as simple as a library was a fight. Everything worthwhile sometimes, I think, evolves into some kind of a conflict. But anyway, you can see that Carnegie was successful in convincing many communities, excuse me, most communities, to allow him to build libraries. And there are almost 1,700 in the US alone. He built them in Europe as well. And there are 31 of them in Oregon. And it died away. The issues died away and really became a question of location. There weren't that many council members that were opposed in Ashland, but there was a concern about where it should go. And the library board proposed it should go at the entrance to Lithia Park. A little hard, can you think about that now? Because I thought that would beautify the area. The only trouble is the water level there's a little shaky, and you couldn't have a very good basement. So they decided that maybe wasn't so good. And then another proposal was up on Granite Street. and then one out on the north end of town. And so they finally in Ashland had an election. I took a vote, and it turned out that it went east because a group of folks up there at that part of town had put together the money for the property, and were able to, in fact, secure that. And then, as you probably know, it's in a park in Medford as well. So eventually, by 1912, both libraries are available, but not without some conflict. Well, here's another of my curiosities. How in the world do you get in such disparate books as this? And these are our claim to fame. Lolita is finished in Ashland, Oregon. And Raggedy Ann and Andy, they're both bestsellers. Raggedy Ann and Andy, that particular book was a bestseller, and that was written up at Lake of the Woods in a cabin and illustrated there by Johnny Gruely, who you probably know was famous for Amos and Andy. Well, I'd heard these stories, and I had actually been up to where Lolita was written. But of course, the house up there, where he wrote that, burned. And so now there's a plaque there, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But I just found it very interesting that we had these two things. And again, I'd heard, Raggedy Ann and Andy, I'd heard that story, and I'd heard Lolita, but I just never really got into it enough to know more about it. Well, Nabokov said that Ashland was his headquarters at 163 Meade Street. And it was actually Professor Arthur Taylor's home that he rented in 1953. The professor was back east traveling, and he was able to secure this place to live. So he had this religious routine for his writing. So in the morning, he would go out and hunt butterflies. He loved to hunt butterflies. And he went all over the valley looking for butterflies all morning. Then he'd come back at noon, have lunch, work on finishing Lolita until dinner, and then start that routine again. And he said the only thing that ever changed that routine was if it was cloudy. The butterflies didn't show up so often. And so he needed to then spend more time on Lolita, but otherwise it was the same way. So then what we end up with up there on Meade Street is this plaque, which some of you may have seen. I'll let you take a second there to read it because I think it's kind of an interesting account. Lolita was wildly successful, as you probably know. And the number is something like 60 million copies worldwide. I mean, it's enormous. But it's also incredibly controversial, and he wasn't able to even get an American printing until 1958. And he was convinced when he went back to Cornell that if he printed it, he'd probably lose his job at the university. As it turned out, it was printed first in France. It was known that he wrote it, and he all of a sudden became the most popular professor on campus at Cornell, and students would take his classes so they could get his autograph. So that turned out a little different than he thought. The other story, a connection here, is the Gruely family, and they were invited to come. These are the Andy and Raggedy Ann and Andy authors, and he's already famous. I mean, he's already publishing like crazy and selling like crazy. But he decides that he will come and move to Granite Street in Ashland. And that's a little odd, why would he do that? Well, he's invited, I should explain that he has a lot of different interests. This is, by the way, this picture of him fishing is, he loved to fish. And so the Rogue River was very attractive to him. But what I wanted to show, oh, and then I wanted to show you there was even a Raggedy Ann sweet shop in Ashland. They stayed here for a year and a half. They lived here. And that was in the Enders building. Some of you probably know where Bloomsbury is and some of that area there. There was a big mall there was a sweet shop there. Well, this is sort of the connection. Johnny was a spiritualist and he did seances. And there was a woman he met in Connecticut and her family, and they did seances together. And she moved to Ashland, Oregon on Granite Street. You know, what are the odds? Anyway, she did. And she kept sending him stories about how wonderful Ashland was and how he should come and they could do seances together again. Well, he was under the gun, so to speak, he was always having to write many, he had a cartoon strip. He had a lot of illustrations he was doing. And of course, he's writing the books. And so as a result, Emma is able to convince him to come on out to Ashland if he will, and he takes 4 months in a cross-country trip to get there. He even has a special bus made so that he can come with Andy and painted on the sides, Raggedy Ann and Andy on the sides. And he does come out and they do seances together. They have parties just below the hill. But here's the key thing. She had a guest house and she offered it to him for as long as they were there. That guest house is being remodeled right now, by the way. And if you go to, if you were to go to Lithia Park, you can actually still see that guest house as it's being reconstructed down the hill a little ways from where it was. So anyway, Emma's successful getting them out there. He loves the area. He puts, like I say, puts on all these parties. It's a big deal. His stuff his dolls and things are featured in stores around town, and everything seems fine until his son gets, but the sons are enrolled in the schools, public schools here at Ashland. And all of a sudden something happens. One of his sons gets scarlet fever and ends up in the hospital. And then just shortly after that, he ends up in the hospital with serious blockages. Enough and he's in his early 40s, enough that they figure he may not live. Well, both recover. And as a result, they're able to survive okay. Johnny's weak. He's not as strong as he was before. And they decide that this is an omen. Remember, he's a spiritualist. And he sees us as an omen. It's time to move back to Connecticut. And so lo and behold, that's exactly what he will do. He'll move back to Connecticut. And but this time he sells it. He sells the tremendous. It's like a motorhome that he's built. He sells that. They sell all their possessions. They take the train back home to Connecticut, and then continue from there. But it was while he was here. Emma, by the way, she also had a cabin at Lake of the Woods, and she made that possible so that he could do his work there, and he did a great deal of work there as well. So those were some interesting ones I wanted to make sure that I got to. I know I'm running out of time here, and it's very hard to cover all the interesting stories there are. There's another one I wondered about, though, and I'll try to do it really quickly. And that is, what in the heck is Erskine Caldwell doing here? The guy never lived here, but he's in a cemetery in Ashland. A private cemetery. And then the other one I was intrigued with was besides him being here, and by the way, incredibly successful. During the Depression, when other people were hurting, he became a very wealthy man because both Tobacco Road and Little Acre, God's Little Acre, were turned into movies. And so he did very, very well at a time when a lot of people didn't. He has 80 million books sold worldwide. Very famous, admittedly in the past. Meanwhile, over here is another one that intrigues me, and that is the Maddox brothers and Rose, who I saw on country music that PBS was just featured not that long ago. And I thought, why are they here? Again, one set's from Georgia, one's from Alabama, and he writes about sharecroppers and she sings about sharecroppers. And it's really kind of an interesting positioning that the two of them, and they both end up in the same cemetery. Way over here in a private cemetery in Ashland, Oregon. I just found that a fascinating story in its own right. So as a result, I had to cover that. Now, you know how many years I drove by the Maddox barn just across the freeway and didn't have a clue who they were or what it was about. So when Ken Burns did his special on the country music, and did quite a long feature actually on Rose and the Maddox brothers, they actually moved. One of the brothers came to Ashland. They came to the Ashland and entertained, or in the Ashland area, actually Roseburg mostly, and they decided that they wanted a ranch. One of them decided he wanted to buy a ranch. So they ended up, all of them moving here. So if you go up in that cemetery, you will find a whole bunch of Maddoxes there, because they all had this a desire to have stay in this nice little area that they'd heard about. And Rose entertained apparently pretty regularly here for a number of years. Unfortunately, I didn't get here quick enough to see her, but I guess some of you may have known Rose. And I think that's a fascinating story in its own right. But I think I'm going to get the hook here, and it's going to be time for me to stop.
Wow, thank you so very much, Joe. That was fascinating stuff. All I want to do is check out that book about the libraries. That sounds like fascinating stuff. So I do have just a few questions here in the chat for you. Our first question is, are Lithia dealerships named after Lithia Springs?
Yeah, they are, and it's named after the Lithia water efforts that were made many, many times. And that's my understanding is that Walt, who had the dealership in Ashland, wanted to name it Lithia because that was, the Lithia water was right there on the plaza, and it had been promoted for so long. It was so well known. Yeah.
Oh, and our next question, and it seems to be the last question here in our chat, is, and I'm very curious about this too. What was the play they were doing the night of the fire?
I'm sorry.
What was the play they were performing during the night of the fire?
Antony and Cleopatra.
Oh, very nice.
And I had put on the slide, I don't know if you saw it, I put on the slide that her dying words were pretty ironic, that she was air and wind, and or fire and wind, yeah. And so it's interesting that that was the particular play that was on, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I do not see any other questions here in the chat. So right now, thank you very much, Joe. We very much appreciate this fantastic presentation in this series. So thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome.